It's That's Lit with me, Shazzy D, here from home. Thanks so much for joining me because today I have a wonderful guest joining me on the show. It's Isabella, and she works in the Australian criminal justice field. Isabella, welcome to the show.
Really glad to be talking to you today. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem at all. So, Isabella, can you talk a little bit about, your work in criminal justice?
Yeah, so I guess I started this career working with young people, predominantly those who have been impacted by both the welfare and the criminal justice system. And there's sort of a few elements to the role in terms of part of my work is sort of investigating welfare related issues and then also addressing criminogenic risks, which basically means likelihood of reoffending and I guess providing interventions to ensure the best way we can that that changes for young people. Yeah.
And so you have, been involved in this field for a while. Why do you think it is so important to have, people of color to be a part of, this sector?
I think there's there's underrepresentation. So when we go into these systems, a lot of the time most people are not used to, a lot of people for the first time, young people, it's their first contact with the justice system, for their families as well. And I guess the cultural element too is that having people, diverse people from backgrounds means there's a bit more cultural understanding, and we sort of fight against those stigmas as well, because it's very hard to, relate to something that you don't know. And so I feel like having more people of colour working within the system provides not only representation, but opportunities and understanding, and aspects and new perspective and how to deal with people from certain cultures. Not saying that because someone acts is from a certain culture they'll act this way, but there's an element of understanding that comes with that. Like, for example, a welfare example being that cultural customs. A lot of people may have, traditions that aren't necessarily familiar with someone who's just identifies as Australian without any other backgrounds. For instance, families going through participating in Ramadan, for instance, understanding what that means during the time of the interview, that you might be, just having more representation means those things aren't forgotten. And in terms of like Black people in particular, there's a lot of issues and intergenerational trauma and things that back home and cultures and practices that will be foreign to a lot of people within the system. And having more people who look like you, in terms of if you are being in contact with the system, I guess provides a sense of comfort, similarly to like when the principles around criminal justice is about being gatekeepers of community, being the reflection of the community, by your own peers, etc. We're sort of around that model, and at the moment, unfortunately, we don't have a full representation. Like, I think I can count on my hands the amount of people of color, particularly Black people of color, who have been in the system working from either as lawyers, case managers, police officers. And it almost feels like it's an impossible thing or something that doesn't happen when it is achievable. And particularly in the times that we are in now, definitely important to have that representation.
And I know, we've mentioned this kind of before, is the whole idea of bias or unconscious bias, I guess, that can sometimes happen, or, you don't even realize it. Can you kind of talk about why, having, more representation can kind of minimize that element in, the criminal justice system?
Yeah, I think everybody's prone to it, depending on where you're from, like down to culture, religion. And I think it's easy to, be aware of your own space. And if you're coming into a role from a particular background, you're not coming in afraid of, the unknown in terms of what you represent. As a Black woman in the system, I come into the system and I know that when I'm, working with clients who are of colour, I'm not judging them based on their skin. I'm not saying that they're likely to have, to reoffend or to be guilty based on how they look or perpetuate stereotypes. And whilst I think some people don't always intentionally need to fall into these situations about believing these stereotypes, it's very easy to do that when you don't have anything else and there's nobody there that can speak up for that group of people. And I think that's where it becomes important. Like, I've had instances even in workplaces where questions that you would think like, surely not people, think that way or would assume those things, point out things where it's just like, no, hold on a minute, like someone's offending doesn't mean that the whole, race or, group of people are responsible for that. And I think, even in the spaces that I'm in, I'm one of maybe 3 Black people in my position. So, and or in my department. And I think it's very, having those conversations, even what I contribute, changes some people's perspectives. And I feel like the more that we do that, we can sort of push these, like, these unconscious bias and sort of make people alert to their own, beliefs or way of being without having to be disrespectful in the space where it can be most impactful. You know what I mean? Because it's one thing to be, saying it in your conversations at home with your friends, but if we're not seeing change within the system itself, it's still going to sort of reflect that. Do you know what I mean? Because who's there to say otherwise?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so there was an example, I guess, or a case. I think you said it was also public record, so you may be able to discuss it, just about kind of the difference in responding to children, I guess, one who was, Caucasian and one, person of color, and how, I guess, they both were involved in the same crime and kind of how that played out. Can you kind of discuss that and how that also works into the idea of bias?
Yeah, and I guess it's no secret, and I guess it's available all over the internet about the overrepresentation in communities where there are people of colour. And we find a lot of the time, there may be young Black boys, for example, who may get into a situation with their non-Black peers, and what we see is they go into the system and their process is a lot more delayed, a lot more strict. Like, for example, the one that's coming to my head at the moment, both minor offences that could have been dealt with by court and in most cases dismissed. Non-Black friends all dismissed. Friends of colour was on bail and stuff like that for almost the entire an extended period. So it's one of those things where it's like the only difference between the two was the colour of their skin. And why is that? Why were we more harsher to the people of colour versus the non-people of colour? And being in a position where you can be in the system and call out those things and speak up for that, in a sense that like many other people might not do. Like, people just say, oh, it's just bad luck for this person. But when you're, I guess, brought up as a person of colour, you're sort of aware of, things always necessarily being harsher on you. And I always say that unconscious bias, like, again, like, it's easy to, you're not conscious of it. So it's easy to just slip into that and to not realize the pattern. And, if we're talking historically, we know what used to go on in a lot of the legal systems. And I guess it's about we're still pushing down some of those barriers that exist and trying to make it more equal and fair. And I think a big part of doing that is having more people of colour.
What advice would you give to any person of colour out there who might be considering a role in the criminal justice field?
I think it would be, don't be afraid to go out. It's likely that when you start, you're probably going to be one of few people that look like you. You're probably going to be at times like the token person of colour in a group. And I think it's important to not see that as a way to dim your light, but to use that to your advantage, in that if you're in a position, you can use what your lived experience to better yourself, and that can be your superpower. And the more, I guess, we get comfortable moving into these spaces, the easier things may be for people of colour as well, in that some of the racial tensions and stuff and relationships between services will improve. And I guess when I think of myself being a young person, when you had all of the various emergency services or criminal justice fields, like, it was very rare, or I can't even think of a time, to be honest, where it was someone that looked like me. And I think the more that we do that, the more we inspire people. And we're in really awesome times right now where people have so much access, and the more representation, we're planting seeds for people to come up and be better. And I really encourage all young people to do it, look into it. Welfare is really important, and you'd be surprised at how much you know and how much knowledge you come into a degree like that with, you know what I mean? Whether that be in the child protection space, whether that be in the juvenile justice or adults, there's room and there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that you can't, I guess the best way to sort of change a system is to be a part of it. And yeah, I guess that's my view on, I guess, and hopefully that inspires someone to do it. Like, it really is an awesome career. Like, there's going to be times where you're dealing with some really sad situations. You're going to be dealing with, and it can be stressful and overwhelming, but knowing that you're part of that change and you're doing something in the community that's going to impact people in a positive way, it's rewarding in that regard, and I think it's really important for like representation in this industry, particularly in these times. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Isabella, that's it. Thank you so much for joining me, for joining the show. It's been great.
Thank you for having me.